Hi, I'm Elizabeth Robson. My guest today is Will Falk. He is a biophilic writer and lawyer. He believes the intensifying destruction of the natural world is the most pressing issue confronting us today. Will recently completed his first book, How Dams Fall, on representing the Colorado River in the first ever American lawsuit seeking rights for a major ecosystem. As one reviewer of his book wrote, How Dams Fall is an act of witness, and what Will was witnessing was the enslavement and invasion of the river to dams, reservoirs, clear-cutting, climate change, and pollution. He writes about trying to defend the Colorado River's right to exist, to flourish, and to speak using the law, and unfortunately failing. And he writes about listening deeply to the river, to learn what the river says she needs to exist. And as the title of the book indicates, he learned that one thing of many the river needs is for those dams to fall. So Will, welcome. Thank you for your work in the world, and thank you for being our guest on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I loved your book, and it's a small little book. It's easy to read in one sitting, but it is so beautifully written, and it really packs an emotional punch. And as I was reading it, I was going to get a pen to underline my favorite passages and then realized I'd end up underlining the entire book. It's so beautiful. Can you tell us what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, and thank you very much for those kind words. That really means a lot to me. The idea behind the book started kind of as the idea for the lawsuit started, and the lawsuit, as you said in the introduction, was a lawsuit seeking personhood and rights of nature for the Colorado River. It was the first federal lawsuit of its kind. But I'm a lawyer. I wasn't the lead attorney on that case. I wasn't licensed in Colorado, so I couldn't file that lawsuit. And we listed the Colorado River as the plaintiff, and I served as something as a legal term called as next friend, which comes from areas of law, like when you're representing a child who may not be able to understand everything that's going on in court. The law lets you appoint a next friend to represent the child's best interests. But I realized that in some ways the Colorado River was something like my client. And whenever a client comes into my office, the first thing I ask her is, who are you and what do you need? So as soon as I thought that, I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could travel with the river, asking the river who she is and what she needs, and then sincerely listening, and then taking what I heard into court to present as her testimony, so to speak. I knew that the judge likely would have been too busy to spend much time with the Colorado River, and practically speaking, it would have been very difficult. It would have been impossible to bring the Colorado River into the courthouse for the judge to really listen. So the idea behind the book was to go and take the river's testimony, listen to what she had to say, and bring that into the courtroom as our best case for why the Colorado River deserves rights of nature, deserves recognition as a legal person, and is in fact someone that is much greater than a person.
I noticed that when you speak about the river, you call her she, and you talk about how the river speaks to you. And I love this. I also try to use she and who when I speak about natural beings and natural communities rather than it or that, to underscore that we're speaking about our peers in the natural world, not our property. So you obviously believe that natural beings can speak and have things to teach us, and that rivers are beings in their own right. So who is the Colorado River to you?
She is a massively and wonderfully complex being who is very resolute in fulfilling her role in life, fulfilling her role as part of the global water cycle. So in some ways, the Colorado River doesn't really begin or end. She's part of this ever cycling water cycle that exists on our planet. Um, she 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 is part of the water that evaporates off the face of the Pacific Ocean and is blown across the American continent to hit the Rocky Mountains, where she condenses as snow and falls across the Rocky Mountains and across the Colorado River Basin. She is sort of traditionally thought of beginning as just north of Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. She flows down through Colorado, through Utah, through little parts of Arizona, through California, and empties into the Gulf of California in the Pacific Ocean. In that path, or going across that path, she goes through some of the driest and most arid regions in the world. So she must be very strong to deliver her waters through those places. She cuts through red rock deserts. She cuts through some of the strongest stone that's known to humans, and she is the way I really think of who she is that she is this process. She is this resolute being who knows that she must deliver her waters, and she does everything that she can to do that. And as we've very much learned lately, water is life. So the Colorado River is a part of life, and she does everything she can to fulfill life.
What are your main concerns? Like as you were traveling along the river and listened to the river, what are your main concerns about the health and well-being of this incredible river?
Well, I think the very first concern is simply humans overdrawing the Colorado River. She one of the most serious threat she faces is simply American law. So the American body of laws surrounding the Colorado River begins with the Colorado River Compact, which is a set of laws that were passed primarily in the 1920s to divvy up her water between 7 American states, between native tribes in the Colorado River basin, and even kicking some of the water down to Mexico. One of the first things that you'll learn if you study the Colorado River Compact is that this law was passed at a time when it was one of the wettest times ever recorded in the Colorado River Basin. And the scientists who helped inform that law were using a number about 15 million acre feet. So the Colorado River Compact assumes that the Colorado River is 15 million acre feet, and they divided the water based on that number. Well, we now know, and in fact, it seems that actually the scientists and politicians back there probably had a pretty good understanding that that was too large of a number too. But setting that aside, we now know that the Colorado River rarely in her long history has ever been 15 million acre feet, and for most of the time she's about 14 million acre feet. So from the very beginning, the Colorado River is divvied up based off of bad numbers. And we've known this for a long time now, and that law just hasn't changed. So one of the most shocking things that I think about the Colorado River, or one of the best examples of the abuse that's been done to her, is the Colorado River very, very rarely flows into the Gulf of California anymore, very rarely fulfills her natural path. She dries up somewhere in Mexico or in California, depending on how much water falls in a given year or how much water is taken in a given year. But To me, it's just that insanity is one of the very first abuses that she experiences, one of the most serious abuses that she experiences. Another major threat is climate change. So the Colorado River, like all bodies of water, depend on the global water cycle, and the global water cycle is being messed up by climate change. In some places, it causes more water to fall. In many places, it causes less water to fall. In the Colorado River Basin, especially, the Colorado River depends on snowpack, and less snow has been falling for several decades due to climate change. So not only are humans overdrawing the Colorado River, using more water than there is actually there, but humans are also creating climate change, which is making less water fall in the area. So she's being sucked dry in several different ways. Other major threats to the Colorado River include pollution from agriculture. There's a lot of, despite the fact that the Colorado River Basin is very arid, and primarily because humans are willing to take too much of her water, there's a lot of sort of inexplicable agriculture in the Colorado River Basin. There are, some of the big things like cotton grown in the Colorado River Basin that just simply shouldn't be grown there. A lot of the Colorado River's water is taken to California, where all kinds of crops are grown. There are weird crops, like there are grapes grown in the Colorado River Basin. I visited the Grand Valley in southern Colorado, and I was shocked to find multiple vineyards in the area. It just seems like a place that grapes should not be. Wine, of course, is not necessary for anything, but especially in a place like Colorado. There's some other threats that I found surprising, and I didn't realize this, but I was visiting. There's a fish hatchery in Grand Junction, Colorado, and the man who manages that fish hatchery was kind enough to spend a day with me and a photographer who went with me on the trip, an Irish photographer named Michelle McCarran. She's really great. Check out her work as a side note. But he spent a day with us, and one of the things that I just never really thought about was there's a lot of mercury poisoning in the Colorado River. And this man told me that, and I checked on this later, and it checks out, something like a third to a half of the mercury that is in the Colorado River is actually produced by coal factories or coal burning places on the Asian continent, and the mercury blows all the way around the world to settle into the Colorado River. So one of the lessons that I always point out from that is the Colorado River's vulnerabilities are not just local, they are global. She really is susceptible to abuse from around the world. So like I said, overallocation, climate change, agricultural and industrial pollution. There are problems with invasive species, both along the Colorado River's banks and actually within her waters. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the 1950s and 60s spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to stock the Colorado River with sport fish like walleye and northern pike, which are not native to the area, and they actually are. There's no real predators for walleye or northern pike, and walleye and northern pike feed off of young juvenile native fish like razorback suckers or bony-tailed chubs. And they're having a really hard time getting rid of those fish, if there's even the governmental will, I guess, to do that. When they do want to get rid of those fish, they're having a really hard time, and those fish have devastated native fish populations. So those are kind of the major threats. I think one interesting thing when thinking about the threats to the Colorado River is most people think that most people assume that if they stopped watering their lawn in the Colorado River Basin, if they stopped taking showers, if they controlled their use of water better, that this would have a large benefit to the Colorado River, and that's just not true, because about 78% of the Colorado River's water is used for agriculture and industry, goes to corporate uses. I think about between 10 and 12% of the Colorado River's water is actually used by households and individual humans. That number is comparable to the amount of water that golf courses in the Colorado River Basin use. So even if every human being in the Colorado River Basin just stopped taking showers and watering their lawns for forever, and we did nothing about the corporations and the industry that uses this water, we still would be having a huge impact on the Colorado River. We might not be able to really alleviate the problems that the Colorado River is facing.
That's really interesting. It's amazing, the difference between what industry uses and what individuals use. And I think, with rights of nature efforts, I think we run into this perception quite often that the rights of nature is going to mean that somehow I can't take a shower or I can't cut down a tree on my property, when in fact the organizations or the groups that are having the most impact is the massive corporations, those industries that you were talking about. So when the lawsuit was filed in Colorado, did you have in mind corporations and industries that you wanted to try to have an impact on with that lawsuit, or can you kind of walk us through what you had in mind as you were approaching that lawsuit?
Yes, I think maybe not so much specific industries or corporations, though. There are some very egregious examples. I think that there's a Nestle bottling operation in California that uses Colorado River water. So, this is the Nestle Corporation, which is known to be very destructive and to be one of the most heinous corporations in the world. Water bottling, of course, is just taking water that people could get from free, that the Colorado River is freely giving, bottling it in plastic, and then selling it back to people. That I think even people who aren't environmentalists can see how horrible something like that is. But it's not so much specific corporations or specific industries that we had in mind as targets, I guess, but more the idea that we wanted to attack and show people how American corporations have more rights than the major ecosystems, the major natural communities, the beings like the Colorado River who give us life. So under American law, corporations have many constitutional rights. They have rights of free speech. They have rights against searches and seizures. They have rights under the Fifth Amendment against takings and being compensated for when the government takes corporate property. And corporations have a lot of money and a lot of power, and the law, access to the American legal system, really requires a lot of money. Everything from filing fees to, it's just kind of true that you can hire more and better lawyers when you have a lot of money to offer them. And those lawyers do have a heavy influence on the lawmaking and the law interpreting process. So we really wanted to point out why is it that corporations who are destroying the planet, corporations who exist to make rich people more money, have constitutional rights. And a being that is responsible for life in the Colorado River Basin, the Colorado River, why she doesn't have any rights. And then as part of that, we also wanted to show that whenever someone who has rights is always more powerful than someone who doesn't have rights. So the obvious example here is American slavery. So for the first 70 or 80 years of American existence, of the United States existence, African Americans did not have rights and therefore could be enslaved and were enslaved and could be bought and sold and all of the atrocities that come with slavery. Well, one of the most solid steps towards I guess African liberation, if we've even achieved that, but towards that was the post-Civil War amendments to the American Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which granted African American citizenship, legal personhood, and gave them constitutional rights. So it's imperative that if we're going to change the balance of power in the United States, that nature is recognized as being sacred, as having their own. I'll say their because nature is filled with so many beings. Nature has their own rights and their own mechanisms for enforcing protection. So rights grant you access to the courts, and in the courts you can ask a judge to order somebody to stop doing something or to do something. And when a judge's order isn't followed, a judge has the power to ask armed men and women, the police, to enforce those rights. So corporations have the power right now to go in and ask a judge to use the police or the National Guard to enforce their rights. And as long as nature doesn't have that power, nature is going to continue to be destroyed and things are going to continue to get worse, as we've seen.
I often, when I think about taking actions to try to protect the natural world, I often think about them in terms of whether an action is a symbolic action, meaning that it's primarily meant to send a message rather than necessarily stop a harm that's happening right now directly, versus non-symbolic, or what we might call direct actions that are designed to stop harms that are happening right now. Can you talk about rights of nature in that frame?
Yes. So the first thing that I think people need to really understand is that rights of nature, for the most part, are symbolic actions. I think in order to understand this, we really need to understand power. And power is a concept that most people, I think, don't understand, and it follows that most environmentalists don't understand. And I take a very simple view of power. Power is simply how things get done. Power is the mechanisms by which physical reality is affected, how we actually make change in the world. So rights of nature, to go into court and ask a judge to enforce rights of nature is primarily a persuasive attempt to get a judge to do something, to get a judge to order that nature has these rights and therefore can call upon the police to enforce those rights. So in that situation, the judge has all the power. On top of that, we need to be really clear that rights of nature are illegal. They conflict with so many American legal doctrines that, and I'm speaking as a lawyer here, it is almost certain that a judge is not ever going to recognize rights of nature. One thing I like to talk about when I say that is I was kind of thinking about how rights of nature compare to the abolition movement and trying to secure rights for African Americans, and as part of this, I did some research into whether there were any federal judges who criticized slavery in their decisions leading up to the Civil War. And I couldn't find a federal judge willing to say that slavery was wrong. Presumably, many of those judges, especially in the northern states, believed that slavery was wrong, but they just weren't going to do anything about it in the courts. The same thing I think is going to happen with rights of nature. Judges are not going to find these. They're not going to find our arguments persuasive. So people, that's not the end of the conversation, though. I think a lot of people hear that and they want to give up. Well, if we can't convince a judge to do the right thing, what do we do? And the point that I want to make, and that I think I contribute to the rights of nature conversation, is if a judge isn't going to do the right thing, we have to do the right thing. So if we take the example of removing a dam from the Colorado River, we can try to use rights of nature like we did in our Colorado River lawsuit, and we could go to the judge and say, hey, the Colorado River has these rights of nature, and the Glen Canyon Dam, for example, is violating those rights. And because the Colorado River has rights, we want you to order government workers to remove that dam. Well, it at least is theoretically possible that the judge could do that, though I'm saying in reality, not going to happen. But how do we actually remove that dam? Well, of course, government workers are going to use explosives to drop that dam. And the point I want to make is there's nothing sacred about that knowledge or that power. We can learn how to use explosives to take down dams, for example. We can learn how to do what's necessary to protect the natural world. We don't need a court order to legitimize what we're doing. If we take the position that protecting the natural world is moral, that the health of the Colorado River is something that needs to be respected, if the health of millions of people is literally tied to the Colorado River, then acting for the health of the Colorado River is a moral action, and we have the sort of the moral imperative to do what needs to be done to protect the river. So yes, rights of nature is basically civil disobedience in the courts. It is not something that is likely to make a physical difference in the world right now. That doesn't mean that rights of nature campaigns and rights of nature laws don't have value. I think that they have a lot of value especially as a symbolic action. And here's why. I think that most Americans believe that you can make change through the legal system. You can make the kinds of change even that we need through the legal system and through sort of state-sanctioned processes. And if we're going to get people to come to the realization that that the legal system isn't going to protect them, because the truth is the legal system isn't going to protect us, we have to show people how that works. And I think that we can do things like tell people that it doesn't work. We can like giving this interview, for example. I'm trying to tell people that if you want to protect the Colorado River more directly, don't start in the courts. In fact, you might want to avoid the courts. But because so many people don't seem to have that understanding, and because we're not seeing people taking the kinds of actions that are needed, like using explosives on a dam, we need to show people very experientially how this works. So when we filed the Colorado River lawsuit, and it was ultimately withdrawn because the Colorado Attorney General threatened the lead attorney on our case with sanctions, and this was a man who ran a primarily pro bono practice. He had other clients besides us, and he just realized that with his practice, it just wasn't worth losing his license, losing his livelihood, to argue these illegal arguments, these arguments that judges really frown upon in the first place. So he withdrew the lawsuit. But in that time, a lot of people were following along, and we were very intentionally providing the analysis behind the lawsuit, trying to explain the legal barriers that we face, trying to explain why the lawsuit was not very likely to succeed. And when the lawsuit was withdrawn and the Attorney General threatened us with sanctions, a lot of people were really, really angry, really angry at the Attorney General. And they were really angry about the whole legal system, and they got to see firsthand how the legal system does a better job protecting corporations and industry and agriculture than it does the beings that give us life. And I think in those moments, one of the things that symbolic actions and civil disobedience can do is they can catalyze those emotions and catalyze escalation in tactics and make it undeniable for people that going into court and thinking that we're actually going to persuade a judge to honor rights of nature just is almost certainly not going to happen. And I think that human beings make decisions as much out of emotion as they do rationality. And when people can really feel that righteous anger, and they can pair that with analysis that shows them why the legal system didn't work, then they might be ready to take the next step and escalate their tactics. And that to me is really the heart and the value of rights of nature work. We get people to ask, how come the legal system isn't protecting us? Why won't it ever protect us? And if it won't ever protect us, what do we need to do about it? And I think those are just hugely valuable lessons that walking people through the rights of nature process can really produce.
And just recently, Lake Erie passed a Bill of Rights to protect the lake and allow the lake to flourish and exist. And so that's an example where the people took the initiative in their own hands and did pass a law, and of course got sued the very next day. So it seems like I will say right off that passing that law and then getting sued has had a huge symbolic meaning in terms of the people who've paid attention to what happened and who perhaps got angry, particularly since the people of Lake Erie weren't even able to drink their water for a number of days because of agricultural pollution. And then just in a week ago, there has now been this huge uranium processing dirt that fell into Lake Erie. So I know you worked a little bit on the Lake Erie actions. Can you talk a little bit about using the initiative process and kind of how that fits in?
Yes. So so the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, I think, really started in August 2014 when an algal bloom got so bad in the Toledo, Ohio area that the city of Toledo's water was undrinkable. They had to shut off the taps. And this was early August, which in Ohio is a very hot, very humid time when you need your water. There simply was no water there. And so a group got together, and they had been following the Rights of Nature movement, and they contacted the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund for help. And the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF is the acronym, has a strategy where, and this strategy it does take a long view. CELDEF works in states that have initiative processes where citizens can draft their own laws, and if they gather enough signatures, like a petition, if they can petition the local government to place the local law on a ballot and have the community directly vote on rights of nature. So they drafted the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which grants Lake Erie the rights to exist, flourish, and regenerate, and it gives Lake Erie personhood the ability to enforce those rights in court. And it strips corporations of their rights as well, as far as those rights violate Lake Erie's rights of nature. They started this in August of 2014, or at least the thinking of this started in August of 2014, and they went through the whole process. They drafted the law. They gathered the requisite signatures, and I can't remember the number of signatures, but it was thousands of signatures that they had to gather and verify on the streets of Toledo. And they survived several challenges before it ever got on the ballot. Local Toledo citizens challenged the law, trying to keep it off the ballot, primarily because the rights of nature do conflict with American law. It went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court said, we can't rule on the validity of the law until after it's actually been passed into law. So it made it onto the ballot, and 61% of the people who voted in the city of Toledo voted to give Lake Erie rights, voted to enact the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. 61% in most Democratic elections is an overwhelming majority. That's a big number. Just the way elections go, getting into the 60% is unusual. So this was a very strong statement by the people of Toledo that they wanted rights for Lake Erie. And as you said, so this was passed at the end of February 2019. And the day, I think it was even like 4 hours after the city certified the election results, said, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights won the election and should be enacted. A local, or not even local, an agricultural business sued the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, saying it was unconstitutional, that it violated their corporate constitutional rights, that it violated principles of an American legal concept called preemption, which makes it so that localities cannot pass laws with stricter regulations than the state does. And that lawsuit has been and is still in the courts. It is still being litigated. And in fact, on January 28th, 2020, is the first real hearing in the case. And it is very likely that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights will be invalidated by a federal court in Toledo on January 28th, 2020. And I think the most important thing to realize about this is, like I said, since the end of 2014, people in Toledo have spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money on the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And as of right now, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is still not in effect. Over 5 years later, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is not protecting Lake Erie. And that happens to us so much in the environmental movement. I say that one of the failures of the environmental movement is too many people ask, what can I do, instead of what needs to be done. And in the case of Lake Erie, what needs to be done is agricultural runoff that produces algal blooms needs to be stopped so that the algae doesn't keep growing and doesn't keep poisoning the water. But so far, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights has done virtually nothing to stop agricultural pollution into Lake Erie. Lake Erie still had bad algal blooms this summer. Lake Erie's water is still being poisoned. And the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, despite all the efforts by people there, has not protected the lake. To go back to what I was saying earlier, though, I'm not saying that this was a waste of time. I think that there are a lot of people, and I've been in Toledo. I've worked with the groups on the ground there. These are really dedicated people, really amazing human beings who are well organized and have poured their heart and souls into the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And they're angry, and they're starting to ask, now what? If the Lake Erie Bill of Rights isn't going to be going into effect, if it's not going to stop the pollution, what do we need to do next? And they've created this whole atmosphere among environmentalists in that area where they've realized firsthand how the American legal system will not protect them, and instead will protect the interests of corporations. So you've disabused all these people. You've broken any illusions that they have in American government, in American democracy even, because what could be a more pure statement of the will of the people than 61% of the people who voted in a city wanted this law to happen, and yet the courts are going to come in and say you can't have that law. So these people, I think, have learned a lot, and they have seen firsthand why the legal system doesn't work, why it protects corporations, and they're people that have gained a lot of skills through this organizing, and hopefully they can learn, and hopefully they can organize to put some tactics in place that actually stop harm to Lake Erie.
Yeah, thinking about the Washington State Constitution, I go back to what it says in the very first section of the Constitution, that the power is inherent in the people. And yet, exactly what you're saying, it's actually the corporations and the judges and some of these laws that we've put into place that has stripped us of the power, so that we, even if we have an initiative and pass by an overwhelming majority a law to protect the environment, it still doesn't actually do much. It's so frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that happened, a classic example of that happened in Ohio over the summer. Some citizens filed a lawsuit against the state of Ohio, arguing that because the state of Ohio intervened in the Lake Erie case to invalidate the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, the state was violating the Ohio Constitution, which says that when government stops serving the people have the right to reform or even abolish the government if they see fit. And the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was an attempt to reform government. So the state of Ohio answered that and said, all lawyers know, and you, judge, should know that section of the Constitution has never been given any meaning. It's a meaningless part of the Ohio State Constitution. I think that as a lawyer, and this is I'm not trying to say this, I know better than other people. I'm just saying, what does it say about all of us lawyers who are like, yeah, we were taught that in law school, that there are whole sections of the Constitution that have no meaning, and yet most people don't know that. But the real point is, what does it mean when the courts are consistently relying on the Constitution to strike down laws, and our constitutions are thought of as the sort of supreme statement of what our government can do and what it can't do? When the courts and lawyers and judges accept that there are just whole parts of constitutions that are meaningless, they're just there as propaganda, essentially. And this is something that plays out over and over again in law, but it's just another example of how, in many ways, American law is there to pay lip service to certain ideals, and in that way pacify us, trick us into thinking that, oh, they must, if it says it in the Constitution, it must be true. We must be able to use it. But in reality, no, we can't.
You talk in your book about how the Colorado River is literally part of the 40 million people who live within the Colorado River watershed. And that really got me thinking about the people who live around the Salish Sea, and how the Salish Sea is literally a part of the people who live around the Salish Sea. And I know that you have visited the Salish Sea and you care about what happens here as well. And so I'm curious about, how you feel about, we're going about our daily business. We forget so easily that we are literally built on the water and the forest and the land here in the Salish Sea region. We all face the threats that face that natural world. How does that make you feel about the Salish Sea?
One of the points that I was trying to make with saying that, or drawing attention to the fact that if you drink water in the Colorado River Basin, it's likely coming from the Colorado River. So if you're hydrated, if you're alive, then and 80% or 75% of the human body is water, then most of you is the Colorado River. And what I'm trying to break down, or what I'm trying to contradict, is this European Western idea that we're somehow separate from the natural communities that we live in, that there's some insane and invisible divide between our bodies and the air around us, and the food that we eat and the water that we drink. And so really, rights of nature and environmental work at its heart is about protecting everyone. It's about protecting all of life. We depend on all of these beings to give us life, and so often critics of ideas like rights of nature, critics of environmentalists, of deep ecologists, they always try and pit us against the natural world, and try and show that if we actually give rights, or we respect the sacredness of beings like the Colorado River or the Salish Sea, then we are somehow hurting humans in doing that. Yes, it is true that humans will lose some of their comforts. Humans will lose some of the things that they've grown to depend upon. But right now, we are harming many humans based off of environmental practices, based off of pollution and other industrial processes. We're cancer. What do people think cancer is? We're not just harming people today, but we're also stealing from our future. If with how many, you look at things like the current mass extinction event, where if you took all of the wildlife that existed in 1970 and weighed it and compared it to all of the wildlife that exists on the planet today, it's something like 60% less. We've lost over half of that in a 50-year time period. So that's everything from animals that we eat, that give again, literally form our bodies and give us life. Those are animals that wildlife and other beings that help form our imagination. There's great work that deep ecologists have pointed out, and sort of eco-psychologists who have pointed out that non-humans are absolutely essential to the healthy development of our brains. Anyone who has lived with a child who is learning how to speak and learning how to think when they're toddlers understands that they really form their minds on the natural world. They try and point out a deer. They try to point out a tree. They try and point out why this flower is different from that flower. And this is how the healthy development of the human mind happens. Of course, that only strikes us as weird when we somehow believe in this separation, when we don't realize that humans have evolved over millions and millions of years, in the natural world, and our minds are built on all those years of evolutionary history. So I also don't want to make protecting the natural world, rights of nature, protecting the Salish Sea or the Colorado River about the benefits that it gives to humans, because I think at the heart of the problem is this idea that humans are supreme and have needs that trump all the needs of the natural world. When we really need to understand that the best way to relate to the natural world is the Salish Sea is a being much more powerful than any human could be, obviously. But the Salish Sea has her own wants and desires and role to play in life. And really bad things happen for everyone, for the Salish Sea, for all the beings that live in the Salish Sea, for all the humans that live near the Salish Sea. When we start to impede the Salish Sea's ability to be the Salish Sea. The same thing happens with the Colorado River. When we dam the Colorado River, when we overdraw the Colorado River, when we don't let the Colorado River flow to the sea like she wants to, we are hurting everyone in this community. And rights of nature is really about understanding that, about returning us to ways of relating to the natural world that takes that as a given. So many people think rights of nature are this very novel concept, this very new idea, and rights are definitely a new Western concept. However, this idea that the natural world is sacred is an original human wisdom. Humans have been practicing and observing and honoring the sacredness of the natural world for our entire history. And it's actually really weird that we view ourselves as different. It's actually a very new phenomenon that human beings have forgotten this and have created these fantasies of separation from the natural world. So, if humans are ever going to live in a sane culture, are ever going to return to a way of living that is cooperative and isn't destroying the natural world, if, in other words, we're going to have a future, the entire planet, all human cultures are going to have to observe something like rights of nature, some sacredness. They're going to have to place barriers between their ability to destroy and the natural world. And that goes for the Colorado River, and it goes for the Salish Sea as well.
Despite what it says in the Washington State Constitution, we know who holds the actual power here, and yet we desperately need a massive cultural mind shift to that attitude you just talked about, that understanding that the natural world is sacred and that without it we don't exist. Do you have any advice for us as we go forward?
My advice would be resist the temptation to think that you're going to magically change American law by yourselves, that even if you succeed in passing a rights of nature law in San Juan County, that it's automatically going to take effect and everything is going to be peaceful and beautiful and wonderful. And I would instead encourage everyone working on this to see your campaign as like you said, part of this broader consciousness shift that I guess we're trying to achieve. This broader cultural change that we're trying to achieve, but also realize that we're running out of time. If they're saying between 100 and 200 species a day are going extinct around the planet, those species have ran out of time. For all the old growth forests that are being cut every second as industrialism rages on, those forests have no more time. And to see rights of nature not as we don't really have time to create a huge cultural shift. using the traditional tactics like law and like the court system and like trying to convince politicians to change the law, and instead see rights of nature as this way to catalyze and escalate tactics that are really needed to break people of the illusion that they can rely on courts and that American courts somehow represent justice, and see your actions as very valuable in breaking people of that illusion. And then also, I think, be talking within your groups about, when when our laws are struck down, what are we going to do next? How do we start training ourselves now to take a more serious step? And when ultimately a court strikes down a rights of nature ordinance, or it isn't interpreted the way you want it to, it doesn't go into effect the way you were thinking, don't despair. Realize that was a big part of the process towards taking the next step, and try and see it that way.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Will. I really appreciate your time today, and it was fabulous having you on the podcast. You have so much wisdom and beautiful thoughts to share about nature, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.